April 15, 1944. 30,000 feet above central Germany, the air was so cold it felt brittle, as if the sky itself might shatter. Inside his Messerschmitt, a veteran pilot from Munich scanned the upper blue, already uneasy. He had flown combat for 3 years. He had downed 17 bombers. He had survived more than 200 missions. The sky had never felt hostile like this. Then he saw them. Tiny silver points glittered in the sun, scattered like coins thrown across glass. They were not bombers. They moved too quickly, too cleanly. They climbed when they should have leveled. They turned with a confidence that didn't match anything the Luftwaffe had faced before. His wingman, a boy from Hamburg who had joined the squadron 6 weeks earlier, asked over the radio what they were. The veteran did not answer. He didn't know. He learned the truth 30 seconds later. The silver dots became aircraft, sleek, laminar-winged fighters that accelerated as if gravity no longer applied to them. P-51 Mustangs. Long-range American escorts that German intelligence had underestimated, dismissed, delayed believing were real. The first burst of .50 caliber fire passed less than a meter from his canopy. The American pilot was a farm boy from Nebraska named William Prey. He had climbed 2,000 feet in the time it took the German to glance at his fuel gauge. The Merlin engine in the Mustang purred smoothly, even here, where the Messerschmitt's supercharger screamed in protest. The German hauled back on the stick, pulling into a climbing turn that had saved his life more times than he could count. 7GS crushed him into his seat. His vision tunneled. The maneuver had always worked. This time, the Mustang stayed with him. Higher. Still climbing. Still closing. At 40,000 feet, where the Messerschmitt should have held the advantage, the American fighter remained steady, guns flashing in short, disciplined bursts. The boy from Hamburg died first. One moment, he was holding formation. The next, his aircraft disintegrated, wings tearing away from the fuselage in a silent, horrifying ballet. No parachute. No time. The veteran pilot shoved his nose down, diving so hard the airframe shuddered, warning of structural failure. He pushed past limits he had never crossed before. The Mustang followed, patient and relentless. At 15,000 feet, he tried his last trick, a snap roll into a split S that had shaken Spitfires for years. The Mustang did not break. The next burst found him. 8 miles away, Major Hermann Bahr watched through his gun sight. He was 28, a Knight's Cross holder with oak leaves, one of a dozen Luftwaffe pilots credited with more than 200 victories. Spain, Poland, France, Britain, Russia. He had seen every enemy aircraft imaginable. He had never seen this. His squadron of 8 had gone after what they believed were easy targets, American bombers drifting behind their formation at altitude. The Mustangs had appeared without warning. Now only 3 German fighters remained, fleeing for their lives. The numbers told a brutal story. A Messerschmitt Bf 109G could reach roughly 385 miles per hour at altitude. A P-51D Mustang could exceed 435. The German fighter's range barely covered its own borders. The Mustang could fly from England to Berlin and back. German armament, 2 machine guns and a single cannon, limited ammunition. American armament, 6 heavy machine guns, thousands of rounds, backed by American factories running around the clock. But the real difference wasn't speed or firepower. It was inevitability. 15,000 American fighter pilots were arriving over Germany with standardized training, flying aircraft built by untouched factories, fueled by oil refined an ocean away, guided by radar networks Germany could no longer disrupt. The war in the air had already been decided. Germany simply hadn't accepted it yet. Captain Hans Dortmann tightened his oxygen mask and checked his instruments. 32,000 feet over Frankfurt. Below him, 60B-17 flying fortresses droned toward the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. 6 months earlier, this would have been a massacre. Today, Dortmann counted 40 Mustangs weaving above the bombers like shepherds guarding livestock. He had 6 fighters. He already knew the outcome. The first time he had met a Mustang, 3 weeks earlier over Berlin, the American pilot had emerged from the sun, closed the distance effortlessly, and stayed glued to him for 12 exhausting minutes. Dortmann had burned nearly all his fuel trying to escape. The American had finally waggled his wings and peeled away when Dortmann's fuel warning light came on. "You live because I allowed it." That memory haunted him more than any wound. Now, he watched as Mustangs controlled the airspace with cold discipline. They did not chase recklessly. They did not dive into bomber formations. They stayed high. They waited. When a Messerschmitt attacked, 2 Mustangs descended to intercept. When it tried to climb away, 2 more were already there. It was systematic, industrial, merciless. Lieutenant Friedrich Haberlin was 22, considered old by current Luftwaffe standards. 17 of his friends had died in the past month. Most of his new squadron mates had fewer than 20 hours in the aircraft they were now expected to fight in. The Americans arrived with hundreds of hours, some with more than 1,000. Haberlin remembered his instructor, an amputee veteran from 1940, telling them that survival depended on knowing an aircraft's limits. The problem was the Mustang seemed to have none. It could turn like a Spitfire, dive like a Thunderbolt, climb like a Messerschmitt, and do all of it while flying twice the distance. Worst of all, it looked effortless. The Luftwaffe had built masterpieces. The Mustang made them look obsolete. The radio crackled, panic, shouting, warnings of Mustangs diving from above. Haberlin looked up into the glare of the sun. Shadows flashed across his canopy. For Mustangs, descending at over 500 miles per hour, he had 2 seconds to decide. Fight or run. He chose to live. Pushing his nose toward the clouds, he dove for 15,000 feet. Behind him, his wingman, a 17-year-old pulled straight from school, tried to follow. The boy had 12 hours in a Messerschmitt. The Mustang pilot who killed him had 1,200. It was not combat. It was execution. By the spring of 1944, the German fighter force was no longer being defeated in dramatic battles. It was being dismantled through arithmetic. Every morning, radar stations along the Dutch coast lit up with new formations crossing the North Sea. Hundreds of bombers. Hundreds more fighters. Always Mustangs. Always enough of them. The Luftwaffe scrambled what it could. Units that existed mostly on paper, squadrons filled with replacement pilots who had never fired their guns in anger. Major Gunther Lutzow read production summaries that felt like death sentences. American factories were turning out Mustangs by the dozens every single day. Germany, building fighters in forests, caves, and bombed-out sheds with slave labor and substitute materials, struggled to complete a fraction of that number. Worse, fuel was disappearing. Pilots measured flight time the way medics measured morphine, sparingly, desperately. Training collapsed first. American pilots arrived at the front with hundreds of hours in the exact aircraft they would fly in combat. They had practiced escort tactics, gunnery, formation discipline, and disengagement procedures until they were instinct. German replacements sometimes had fewer than 40 hours total time, often less than 20 in a Messerschmitt, before being sent up against Mustangs flown by calm, disciplined professionals. Captain Franz Stigler walked through the ruins of his squadron's ready room after a Mustang strafing attack. 8 pilots dead, 12 aircraft burned in their revetments. The fuel depot still smoldered. The Americans had lost 1 aircraft, its pilot already back in England, drinking warm beer and writing a letter home. Stigler had once believed in chivalry in the air. He had spared a damaged bomber in 1943, refusing to shoot at a defenseless crew. But this was no longer a contest of knights. The Mustang pilots did not seek duels. They executed missions. They attacked airfields. They destroyed fuel trucks. They erased training schools. The Luftwaffe was not losing dogfights. It was losing the ability to exist. Reports from the front became monotonous in their horror. Fighters intercepted before reaching bombers. Units wiped out in minutes. Entire Gruppen grounded not by enemy fire, but by lack of fuel to take off again. German pilots who survived engagements often landed at damaged fields only to find no gasoline for another sortie. Lieutenant Heinz Koch stood beside his burning Messerschmitt after being shot down and felt relief instead of fear. The war was over for him. No more dawn patrols against impossible odds. No more watching boys die because someone higher up still believed in miracles. He remembered his first encounter with a Mustang. The American had appeared from above, closed effortlessly, fired 1 controlled burst, and broken away without pressing the kill. The message had been unmistakable. You live because I choose efficiency over risk. Desperation made German pilots predictable. Predictability made them easy targets. The Mustang did not win through brilliance. It won through discipline. Every American squadron flew the same doctrine. When one unit discovered an effective tactic, Every other unit learned it within days. There were no lone heroes, no reckless charges. Mustang pilots fought like engineers, applying pressure exactly where it produced the most collapse. German pilots still fought as individuals. Americans fought as systems. Major Adolf Galland saw the truth clearly and too late. He argued that Germany needed one simple fighter, built in overwhelming numbers, flown by adequately trained pilots. Instead, Germany chased perfection, jets, experimental designs, wonder weapons, while the Americans perfected adequacy at scale. The jet fighters came, brilliant and terrifying. They were fast enough to strike bombers and escape. But they needed special fuel Germany could barely produce, long runways that bombers destroyed daily, and experienced pilots who no longer existed. Time, more than any aircraft, was the enemy. Colonel Gustav Rudel briefed his pilots for what everyone understood was a suicide mission. 8 fighters against hundreds of bombers and escorts. The faces staring back at him were heartbreakingly young. 19, 18, some younger. They believed courage could still change history. Rudel knew better. He had flown since 1938. 97 confirmed victories. He had seen the Luftwaffe at its height, when German fighters ruled from the Atlantic to the Urals. Now he commanded ghosts. They took off anyway. Some did not even reach the bombers. Mustangs intercepted them at altitude, forced them into defensive maneuvers, burned their fuel away, and destroyed them piecemeal. The few survivors limped home to find their airfields cratered, their fuel gone, their ground crews drafted into the infantry. The Americans were not just winning the air war. They were erasing Germany's ability to contest it at all. Standing beside his grounded fighter, Rudel understood the final truth. Germany had not been defeated by a better airplane. It had been defeated by an entire nation organized to produce victory. The Mustang was simply the most visible expression of that reality. By April 1945, the sky over Germany no longer belonged to Germany. It belonged to schedules, fuel tables, escort doctrines, and production quotas, most of them American. General Adolf Galland stood before the remaining commanders of the German fighter force and finally abandoned pretense. What remained of the Luftwaffe existed only on paper. Entire wings were ghosts. Squadrons that once fielded 90 aircraft now counted fewer than 5 that could fly. Fuel was rationed by the leader, ammunition by the second. Experienced pilots were either dead, captured, or grounded by wounds that never healed properly. The briefing was supposed to be about countermeasures against the Mustang. There were none. The P-51 had not just defeated German fighters. It had rendered the idea of air superiority through individual excellence obsolete. It could escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. It could hunt fighters, bomb airfields, strafe trains, and still outrun anything sent to stop it. Most devastating of all, it could be flown effectively by pilots who were not aces. Germany had built fighters that required masters. America built fighters that required competence. And competence, multiplied by thousands, crushed mastery. Lieutenant Stefan Lichten, 17 years old, flew his first combat mission on April 25th. He had 15 hours of total flight time. 8 in a Messerschmitt. His radio barely worked. His gun sight was misaligned. His engine ran rough on low-grade fuel. For Mustangs found him at 8,000 feet. They did not fire. The flight leader wagged his wings. "Follow us." Lichten remembered his instructor's last words, spoken the day before he was killed. Germany needs witnesses, not dead heroes. Lichten followed. He landed at an American-controlled airfield and surrendered. The Americans were calm, professional, almost gentle. One pilot, barely older than him, told him, in broken German, "You're lucky. In 2 days there won't be anywhere left to land." Standing beside his surrendered fighter, Lichten finally understood what the older pilots had been trying to explain. The war had not been lost in the last weeks or months. It had been lost the moment American industry entered it. Courage could not defeat logistics. Skill could not defeat production. Heroism could not defeat systems. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The Luftwaffe ceased to exist. Of the tens of thousands of pilots who had flown for Germany during the war, fewer than 1,000 remained alive and uncaptured. Many had died before the Mustang ever appeared. But the Mustang ensured that those who remained could no longer change anything. The final German fighter pilot killed in combat died hours after the surrender, shot down by Mustangs while attempting one last futile interception. The American report listed it as routine. There was no drama left to record. Captured German pilots were debriefed extensively. Their testimonies were strikingly consistent. The Mustang was not miraculous. It was simply unstoppable because it was part of something larger. You could shoot down a Mustang, one pilot said, but you could not shoot down the factory that built it, the school that trained its pilot, or the tanker that brought its fuel. Some German aces survived to fly again in peacetime. Test pilots, airline captains, instructors. They spoke little of the war, and even less of its end. When asked about the Mustang, they usually said only, "It was a fine aircraft, flown by disciplined men." What they did not say, what hurt too much to articulate, was that it proved everything they believed about air combat was outdated. Individual brilliance had been replaced by collective efficiency. The age of the ace had ended. The age of systems had begun. Years later, a former Luftwaffe general was asked what might have happened if Germany had developed the Mustang first. He laughed bitterly. "We would have built 100 perfect ones," he said, "instead of 5,000 good ones, and we still would have lost." That was the Mustang's lesson. Not that it was the best fighter ever built, but that it was good enough, and there were thousands of it. In modern war, good enough, multiplied at scale, beats perfection every time. The Messerschmitt was a masterpiece. The Mustang was a solution, and solutions win wars.